chapter 24. Proverbs chapter 24. One thing that we have to watch every day of our lives as Christians is spiritual neglect in our lives. And here we see a passage that is illustrative of a drift. Hebrews warns us of that. Be careful not to drift. Well, throughout the Bible, Christ, of course, when he is here on earth, he says, watch and pray. Paul says the same thing, watch, be careful. And so here is this illustration that we find in the book of Proverbs. And, of course, Proverbs is that wonderful book that gives us these, most of the time, short sayings that have deep truths. And many times it will say it one way and say it again to emphasize the point a different way. But here we kind of have somewhat of a lengthy passage, several verses, that explain a situation that is happening. And what is happening here is the neglect of a vineyard. Now I want to begin at verse 30, and look what it says here. It says, I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. Verse 31, and lo, it was all grown over with thorns and nettles, had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall thereof was broken down. Then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. Then verse 33, yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. Then verse 34, so shall thy poverty come as one that travelleth, and thy want as an armed man. One of the most valuable possessions in Palestine during biblical times, and it might well be now, was a vineyard. A vineyard. Israel, Christ, and the church are all illustrated as a vine and its branches. Throughout the Bible, you'll see these literal vineyards, but you'll also see this vineyard become illustrative of spiritual things. To have a vineyard in biblical times was synonymous with having nourishment, security, prosperity, actually the essentials of life. The first time that we see a vineyard mentioned is in Genesis chapter 9. And it seemed to have been a priority much earlier than that. To dwell, as we see in the Bible, we'll see these illustrations, to dwell under the vine is emblematic of domestic happiness and tranquility and peace. One time we see in the Bible in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 30, it says, they gathered the grapes with shouts of joy. So we see that the vineyard is always, throughout the Bible, illustrated in a literal sense of bringing joy because it provided sustenance. But also it was illustrative of a spiritual relationship with the Lord. Now, as we look at this passage, I want you, there's a couple ways to look at this. If you're just looking at it, textbook interpretation. In other words, you're just preaching a message, you want to give a textbook 3 points. It would simply be this. Verses 30 and 32 would be an observation. In other words, here is the sage, the writer of Proverbs, making an observation. And then verse 33, we see the interpretation of that observation. And then verse 34 is the application of what he has observed. I'm going to do it a little differently. First of all, I want to look at, in verse 30, the potential that this vineyard had. It says here in this passage, verse 30, it says simply, I went by the field of the slothful and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. Now he approaches this vineyard. Now again, when we think about the potential of this vineyard, we think about food, we think about drink, we think about livelihood. They would do all kinds of things. As you know, raisins comes from grapes. That was something that was provided by grapes. They had juices they had syrups, they had paste, even paste to put on bread. So this vineyard was a complete source of nutrition for these Palestinians. And really, again, if you look at it spiritually, we know Christ was called the vine, the thing that gives this spiritual sustenance to us. And so throughout the Bible, we see this illustrated. But the great potential here, something that really not everybody had, was a vineyard. And it was to be treasured, it would be cared for, it would be carefully cultivated in order to make sure that this fruit reached its potential. And of course today, it's easy to parallel it to our Christian life. We have, through Christ, get this, the ability to be spiritually successful. Christ, when he died on the cross, he's given us eternal life, but he didn't only just buy the right for eternal life for us as we trust him, but he's given us the opportunity to live the abundant life. The abundant life. And of course, we know that this abundant life that we have in Christ is ours, but it has to be cared for. We have to be careful. We have great potential to serve the God of creation. We have great potential to enter into that abundant life, but we got to be careful because it can be quickly snatched away from us, as we can see in this illustration. So first of all, we see a great potential, but then we see a problem. And the problem was simply this. The problem was neglect. We see again in verse 30 here, it says, he went by a field, he went by this vineyard, but notice it was a vineyard of the slothful person, the person that was void of understanding. In other words, he was a person that was lazy. He was a person that didn't cultivate the ground. He was a person that kind of sat back and just said, hey, you know what? It'll just take care of itself. Kind of what we do sometimes in our spiritual life. He had no, when it says void of understanding, get this, he had no sense of value of what he had. He forgot that he needed defenses in life. He forgot he needed to each day check the garden, make sure there was no weeds there. To check the vineyard and make sure it was pruned, make sure that it was taken care of. Because every day either works for him or against him in this endeavor to produce fruit. Every day. You can't take any time off. You know, if you have a garden, and many of you had, you know the nature of a garden. You know this, that weeds grow much faster than beans and tomato plants. I don't know why. I mean, just overnight, boom, there it is. And that nut grass grows faster than anything in the world. It just, boom, it's there. Who planted that? Nobody planted it. It's there in the soil. By nature, this soil is against you producing fruit. That's the way it is. Now, folks, let's turn that into our spiritual life. That's the way it is. We can't just sit back and think spiritual things will take care of themselves. This great vineyard that we have, this relationship with Christ, we can't think, well, it's just going to take care of itself, and we just sit back, take our ease, and, everything's going to be all right. Hogwash! You know that. We know that in life we need these fences. We need to continue to remind ourselves that we need standards in our lives. That we have to put guards on all these things that the world pushes our way. And we have to understand if we're not careful, we let our fences down and bad things begin to happen. The foxes of this world, the wild boar of this world, the jackals of this world, they are not your friends. They want to destroy your fruit-making ability. They want to get in your vineyard. They want to interrupt this growth. Now, there's two approaches to this. First of all, there's the inward approach, and both are mentioned here. It says this in verse 31. Get this. It says, and lo, it was all grown over with thorns and nettles, and it covered the face thereof. Folks, when we're fighting our spiritual battles, first of all, there's a battle from within. Now, within the fences. We're not talking about the fences now. I'm talking about ourselves. I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking the battles that we fight within. Uh, as I was studying a little bit about this thorn and nettles, did you know these thorns in the Middle East, and we remember the crown on Christ's head, and the blood that trickled down because how sharp those thorns were. They were sharp as needles, and they're about 2 inches long. Now this is the kind of thorns that come up. Now can you imagine this? Can you imagine going out there and seeing that the first day it comes up, that little vine that comes up, that little nettles and thorns. Thorns are the ones that are long and hard as bones and 2 inches long, and they grow up in this bush, and they're terribly hard to manage and get rid of when they get grown. Nettles are more like a like a cactus, we'd think, a cactus. It's got all these little prickly things on, and all these things through neglect will grow up. Now think about this, folks. When they first come out of the soil, you know this. When they first come out of the soil, you just go and you just pluck them right up. And they're not that hard to deal with if you're diligent. If every day you're on the task. If you understand what's going on, you pluck them up. It's not a problem. But you let them grow. You let them take root. You let those bushes start growing and start having branches and start developing those thorns. And those thorns get dried, and they're 2 inches long, and they're as hard as bone. You got a problem then. That's the way it is in our spiritual lives if we're not careful, if we don't nip it. If we don't understand these desires that we have within, if we don't cut it off, then first thing you know, we're in pornography. First thing you know, we're in these lusts and things that will destroy our spiritual life, cause us to be unproductive for the things of God. These desires that we have from within, if we don't stop them when they begin, then what happens, they're cultivated in our life. We neglect to do what we need to do, and first thing you know, they become problems and fruit cannot grow. The Bible warns us of that over and over and over in the New Testament. These thoughts that come in our minds, these desires that come into our lives, these attitudes that we have, they can be neglected and become a very difficult thing to remove as we nurse them. Every action that we have is conceived inwardly in our minds. And if we're not careful, we forget that we have been purged. We forget that we are saved and we're put here in order to glorify God. And we let those things in our minds take over our lives. Fear, doubt, anxieties, passions, lust. All these things begin to be played out in our lives because of neglect. Every day it's spiritual roundup. Every day we're spraying those weeds. Life's about pest control, folks. You know, I talk to the pest control people, and it's become one of my best illustrations. You know, life's about pest control. Your health's about pest control, right? You try to shoot all the bad things, and you know, if there's something, if there's some kind of problem that you're having, you hope it's on its back kicking its legs rather than running fast as it can. That bug, whatever it is, you're trying to kill it. We take things to try to kill those things because there's a constant push to take over. There's a carnal gravitational pull that wants us to be pulled down to be earthy and to be like the world and to be ineffective for Christ. We got to be careful from within. Then outwardly. Notice here, it not only are the thorns and the nettles on the inside, but it says the stone wall thereof was broken down. Now these things are on the outside. We deal with our own selves, our own attitudes, our own desires, our own passions. We have to keep them under control. We have to make sure that every day we come in line with Christ, that we're plucking it up when it comes out of the ground, that we don't let it grow within our minds. But all of a sudden, we're bombarded from the outside, from the world. The world wants us. And what they're trying to do is break down our walls of conviction, our standards, to be able to open up that fence so the wild boars, the foxes, all those pests that are outside can come inside. Here, the stone wall was broken down. All of a sudden, I'm susceptible to addictions. I'm susceptible to the things of the world because the garbage now is being poured in. I'm allowing my mind to be captured by the things of this world because my defensive have been broken down. I forgot. I let my standards down. I let my guard down. And those things of the world are now coming in. Let me tell you, folks, its end result is total destruction of your vineyard. It wants to completely eliminate anything for the Lord. Now, we see the potential, we see the problem. And notice this problem analyzed in verses 32 and verse 33. It says, "Then I saw and considered well. I looked upon it and received instruction." Listen, your problem is laziness. It says there in verse 33, you had a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. You know this, folks. Go back to the garden. Go back to your lawn. Go back to your stinking living room, your kitchen. Does it ever clean itself? Is the pull always towards messiness? Don't you have to be diligent to keep your house clean, to keep your yard the way it should be, to keep your car clean? I mean, it's a constant every day. You got to be careful. You got to get some time into it. Why do we think our spiritual lives are any different? Why do we think that we can neglect Bible, we can neglect prayer, we can neglect church, and think it doesn't affect us some way? How can we be lazy on the things of God and think that somehow we'll just pick up where we left off? Solomon is saying it doesn't work in nature and it doesn't work in spiritual things as well. We have to be diligent. We have to be that watchman. We can't fall asleep. We can't fall asleep. You know, the Great Wall of China stretches, hundreds of miles. What a feat building that. I've never been there. You know, some of the places you'd like to go is to see that. Never so often they had watchmen set up there. Watchmen. You know, it was dependent upon that watchman to look out and see the enemy coming. Because no matter how big the wall or how structured that wall is, someone could get in if you don't have a watchman. Well, the way it was overcome, this huge wall, this wall that seemed so formidable, how in the world did they overcome it? They simply paid off the watchman. And they crawled over and invaded China. Folks, this is what's happening in our lives if we're not careful. The world, sometimes we think our greatest enemy is liberalism. We think our greatest enemies are God-haters out there. We think, China, the China balloons, a threat, and China's a threat. That's not our biggest threats, folks. Our biggest threat is neglect, is lack of diligence in our spiritual life. Do you realize what God can do through a vineyard that's well manicured, through a vineyard that keeps its vines pruned? Can you imagine the fruit that's there? The potential? God says, listen, be careful. There's a problem. There's slothfulness. There's laziness. There's a folding of the hands. And it's interesting here in this passage as it's telling us, notice it's just a little sleep. There's not a lot of sleep. It's not a lot of neglect. Did you notice that? Matter of fact, he uses the word little 3 different times. He's saying it didn't take much, just a little bit.